here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. I want to get right down to it. Joining us on the line, dialing in some of the most atrocious weather imaginable, but as always, a liberty and civil liberty warrior is Stephen Brown. He is the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Rhode Island chapter. And they issued, I believe, a timely, a provocative, yet at the same time contemplative piece this afternoon discussing the executive order issuing what's referred to as red flag laws. We're all aware of the tragedy that took place in Florida just in the past few days. Seemingly yet another step downward as school violence appears to, at least superficially, escalate around the country. People can debate whether or not it's truly on the rise. They can point out to statistics, they can point out to gun laws, they can point to a number of issues. But ultimately there was real human tragedy that took place. And the backdrop of this, of course, is the notion that government should always be reactive. Earlier this week, Gina Raimondo issued an executive order implementing red flag laws here in the state, and I'll give a very simple layman's interpretation of it, and then I'll hand the mic over to a real expert. But ultimately, the notion that there are damaged souls amongst us who are mentally incapable of having access to firearms, and as a result, my interpretation, extra-legal processes should take place to separate them from them. What we must always remember is a constitutional right, the right to bear arms. This is complex, and as I pointed out, requires, well, sober thought, contemplation, a mature approach. Stephen, welcome back to the coalition. Thank you for joining us again. You folks took the time over the last few days, in the body of work element that's available not just in the press release, but in terms of substantiation of pure data. I believe it's 14 pages of supporting information is invaluable at a time like this when, well, quite frankly, there are folks panicking. I've got to ask you, on its most superficial level, you had a terrible tragedy take place last week. Innocent children died. Government then reacts and says, we're going to remove the arms from people that we perceive to be a threat. The average person will say in that moment of tragedy, well, what's the matter with that? Why isn't that a good idea? Stephen, what's the response to the RI ACLU?
Well, first, well, thank you for inviting me. I think the first reaction is there may be things that can and should be done. The ACLU is not like the NRA opposed to reasonable gun regulations in a variety of aspects, but we do have strong and independent concerns about due process and privacy when dealing with these issues, and the question is, how do you respond? And as you noted, we've done an analysis of the legislation that's been introduced. It is called this red flag legislation, the idea being that if somebody is sending out potential signals that they may be prepared to engage in violence, there should be some mechanism available to take the firearms away from them. But our concern about this legislation is that it is written extremely broadly, and I'm not sure many people appreciate just how broad the language is, and that's what concerns us. It is, despite what happened in Parkland, which of course was a terrible tragedy, this legislation goes much farther than trying to address that issue. It has some very open-ended language about who constitutes a danger for whom firearms can be taken. And it's not limited to situations where you think there's an imminent threat occurring. It's not limited to situations where a person has actually threatened to engage in some violent activity. The wording is just so broad it can ensnare a lot of people and then be subject to a court hearing where they lose access to their lawfully owned firearms for at least a year. They may be subject to a mental health evaluation against their will. They will not necessarily be entitled to appointed counsel to help them in a proceeding like this, and those sorts of due process concerns are what has led us to issue this analysis and raise concerns about the legislation.
Right. One of the things that you point out is to me, and I'm a history buff, but I'm an amateur history buff. I often point out in totalitarian societies that very often political opposition can be misconstrued as being someone not of sound mind. For folks that think this can't happen, it happens routinely around the world. I think there's a tendency sometimes to ignore the slippery slope that can exist even in a freedom-loving country like the United States because, quote unquote, it can't happen here. You point out language, overblown political rhetoric on social media. What do you mean by that? I mean, give us some examples that you think could be in danger of violating these red flag laws, which could be potentially part of protected speech.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've seen this a number of times, and you've probably read or heard of situations where somebody has said something on social media, not quite as politely as they should, and they suddenly get a visit by police, or if it involves the federal government, the Secret Service are knocking on their door. And, it's people who are saying things rashly, but not with any real indication that they plan on engaging in some sort of violence. But they say things impolitely and in ways that they shouldn't. But that in and of itself, even if there isn't a credible threat of violence, it could lead to the issuance of the filing of a petition against the person, who would then have to show up in court and challenge this effort to have them subject to these court orders that would have the consequences that I just talked about.
It's ironic that just literally days after the Senator Kettle controversy, where on a much more benign level, but equally serious, if you will, the state Senate attempted to create my term, and it's sort of, again, a layman's term, I call it an extra legal process, where let's invent a show, let's not consider the constitutional rights or need for due process, or, as importantly, as you point out in your release, the lifelong effects if this can have upon an individual, how they're perceived by the community, their civil rights, their ability to gain counsel. In emotionally charged times like this, on a hyper-local level, you had a senator who remains accused, not convicted, but accused of some fairly egregious behavior. Not something that we as a society want to tolerate, but remains accused. And then on this grander level, we are willing to engage in this chase for people who are just, well, quite frankly, in its most logical extreme, just being obnoxious. Are we losing sight of the concept of due process here in this society, or do you think this is just a temporary hiccup?
I think there are always challenges to due process. I don't think there's anything unique about what we're seeing here in these two incidents. You're right, as you know, we did raise concerns about the way the Senate was planning to act on the Senator Kettle matter by scheduling an expulsion hearing without any rules governing how it would work. Obviously it became moot when Senator Kettle decided to resign, but we were very, very concerned that they were scheduling this expulsion hearing, and nobody really had any idea about how it would work, what sort of opportunity he would have to present a defense, we thought it was important to make note of that. And we're hoping that, they dodged the bullet here when Senator Kettle resigned, but we hope they'll take this opportunity in the coming months to come up with rules so that something is in place if and when this situation arises again, so that they aren't just caught by surprise again and don't know how to proceed.
I believe Senator Jabbour might have penned an open letter requesting, if you will, the creation of said process. So at one level, there's a tendency here in Rhode Island, as probably elsewhere, to lurch from crisis du jour to the next crisis. We get beyond a certain point where at least the symptoms are gone, and we have a little bit of a collective amnesia, and we lurch on to the next crisis, not really fixing things. Interestingly enough, a really long-term approach to fixing ethics issues was in the news this week. I was involved in the organization that supported the creation and I'll call it the re-empowerment of the ethics board. But whether it be ethics issues, whether it be due process issues, whether it be how we look at people like this in society, you really can't ever just walk away from it, can you? I mean, these are all evolving issues. I mean, who would have predicted 10 or 15 years ago the notion that a threat on a computer could have the resonance that some would suggest as part of this red flag legislation, or I should say executive order, should be reacted to by the full force and weight of state criminal enforcement. Can you ever really stop analyzing these situations?
No, never. You know, the ACLU's founder, almost 100 years ago, made the comment that no battle for civil liberties ever stays won, and it's very true. You never completely win. Issues continue to crop up. You think you've won a case, and then a public official or an agency decides to ignore it. Or, as you're suggesting, new issues arise. And in this instance, you know, when you're dealing with new technology, there are new issues that have to be dealt with, and people have to figure out how to apply civil liberties principles to new technologies. So it's a never-ending battle. You know, unfortunately, I don't think the ACLU will ever have the opportunity to go out of business, but it is critical that we keep a constant vigilance on what our government is doing and be prepared to respond when necessary.
Speaker Mattiello has effectively green-lighted some form of red flag legislation to take place, one that ostensibly would take place through normal legislative channels. I mean, I have tremendous respect and regard for the ACLU, so I won't engage in a conversation about the political motivations for this executive order. So let's look at it on a positive level going forward. What's important to you in the legislation that I believe ultimately will be created? What safeguards are critical for Speaker Mattiello and the General Assembly to consider?
Well, I really can't put it in the form of just a couple sentences.
Right.
You know, that's why our analysis took 14 pages.
Right.
But we do believe that, you know, there is legislation that can be drafted to address this issue, to focus on having a process that allows law enforcement to be able to take weapons away from people when there's a legitimate and credible fear that this person presents an imminent danger to others. But it does require, you know, a lot of careful crafting of the legislation, and we're hopeful that, you know, our analysis provides a guidepost for legislators if they want to try to address these issues to do so, and to come up with legislation that both protects the public, ensures public safety, while at the same time incorporating some basic due process safeguards.
Mm-hmm. You know, civil commitment is an issue that, you know, particularly as the population gets older, again, technology, in this case, disease, often changes the public policy and a public approach. Civil commitment, I believe, is an area of the law which has never been more challenged because of the onset of all these hideous diseases like Alzheimer's, which seem to be unfortunately growing amongst the population. Is without ruining the because we are going to promote your link to this analysis it's critical that people take a breath and take a deep breath and read your analysis and your critique of the system. But we take the process of civil commitment in most states in this country very, very seriously. Is it fair to say that this red flag law should be held in that same sort of highly articulated legal perspective?
Well, it depends on what's going on. I mean, there is a difference between actually engaging in civil commitment, I mean, taking away a person's liberty, versus just taking away their property. I don't want to demean that, but there is a big difference if you're being locked up somewhere versus the government taking some property from you. One of the issues in this legislation is that there's the potential to do both. And one of the things we argue is that if you're going to have a court have the authority to require a person to have a mental health evaluation as part of this red flag process, without the proper safeguards in place, it's really an end run around, as you've noted, the strict laws that are in place for dealing with civil commitment proceedings. So if you want to do that, then you ought to be looking at the civil commitment law. But this bill, again, is designed to do much more. And you know, I don't think the evidence is out there to suggest that anybody who has a mental illness is all of a sudden, should be treated as suspect. And that's the conclusion that unfortunately a lot of people jump to when these things happen, and sort of stigmatize anybody with a mental illness.
Right.
That would be a mistake too.
Right. I got your reference to the movie Minority Report. If folks haven't seen Minority Report, takes place in a future world where science and behavioral sciences have evolved to the point where allegedly violent behavior is predictive, and you essentially can pre-arrest someone. As an action movie, it was okay. It was a fairly good movie. If you're attuned to the notion of civil liberties, it was one of the more horrifying movies of that generation, because it pointed to a society which attempted to preclude any notion of actual behavioral guilt or actual intent. It just the potential was there, and that was predictive enough for folks to engage in ultimately detention. So I thought that was a particularly apt analogy. I guess in summary, I think it's fair to say that when these hearings come up in the General Assembly, I believe you'll be a fixture in that at those hearings. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, we do expect to testify. Yep.
Okay, that's great. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me on this rainy night. How can and we'll we do our bit. We try to publicize whenever we can. How can folks read this? How can folks contribute to the ACLU here in Rhode Island directly as you guys continue to play such a seminal role in our body politics? How can folks get a hold of you?
Well, people can go to our website, which is www.riaclu.org. And from there, you'll be able to find information about this particular issue. You can join, you can donate. We make it very easy for people who want to do that, to be able to do so directly from our website. All of our work is funded by private donations and membership. So we certainly encourage anybody who supports what we're doing to help us in that way. Excellent.
A few years ago, you spent some time with me on the radio. We spent an hour talking about the history, and we called it "Why You Should Join the ACLU." It's in weeks like this, after moments like last week, that we replay that interview. We tied it into the pre-show publicity of your attendance because, well, it really hasn't changed. It's the issue, as you pointed out, the challenges are timeless, and we hope you folks continue to be the force you are in protecting really all perspectives in society. And again, I'm thrilled that you came out with this. We are going to be reaching out, by the way, folks, to the National ACLU to talk about FOSTA. It's an issue we covered last week. We'll get more into that in the next session. But Stephen, again, thank you so much for joining us on a really rainy, terrible evening.
Thank you, Pat. Take care.
All right. Folks, Stephen Brown, the Executive Director of your Rhode Island American Civil Liberties Union. What's the takeaway from this conversation? First of all, you need to join the ACLU. I prefer to have this element of the conversation after Mr. Brown is off because I refuse to politicize his work because it is noble. It is largely apolitical, despite how certain sides may feel about it at any one given moment. There's a tendency to villainize the ACLU, depending on which side of the issue you are on, what your perspective is on an individual event like this. To which I would say is a rather simplistic response. If at some point they're pissing off everybody, they're probably doing their job. A writer who I allude to constantly on the show, who had a tremendous impact on my life, is a gentleman by the name of Nat Hentoff, who passed away this past year. He was a civil liberties writer and jazz columnist, if you will, for the Village Voice of New York City. An amazing author. He penned a tome called Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee. And he too was famous for, well, pretty much everybody was mad at him at one point. But ultimately, if character is doing the right thing when no one is watching, then protecting your civil liberties when it's the least convenient, the most challenging, the most emotional moments, that's when it's the most important. We live in a world of various shades of grays. There are no blacks and whites. Every issue, every response has got its own unintended consequences. As we react to horrific tragedies like what happened in Parkland, if we were to simultaneously do so in a manner which is to abridge the rights of the few, then ultimately we would sacrifice the rights of many. We do not dishonor the victims of Parkland by asking people to take a pause, to take a moment's break, and reflect on the tragedy, the root causes, and the potential impact of how we react to it. We do not do them dishonor. We recognize that those lives were grotesquely cut short in a manner no parent should ever have to endure. But, and here's the but, we need to take that collective deep breath. We need to look at all of the issues as they surround society. We need to question leaders who would quickly attempt to politicize these events, who grandstand, who lead the march for their own personal purposes, who create false tropes about their family and what their motivation was for, and the chain of events that led up to their motivation. We need to do that on both sides. There is no right or wrong on this, regardless of whether you're Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal. When it comes to fundamental liberties, liberties that I as a libertarian believe that I was born with, and that all of you are born with, we cannot let tragedy, even the most deeply felt tragedies, impact those long-term liberties. We're going to take a little bit of a break right now. Again, it's a challenging evening here in Rhode Island. Terrible weather outside. It's a good night to stay at home. Grab a yacht club. By the way, available at restaurants and dining institutions across the state. Also available at Eastside Marketplace. Read a book. Hopefully you've got power. I just found out I don't. But stay safe. Folks, this is the Coalition Loud and Proud, Outrage Porn Free, Civilly Disobedient Media, broadcasting live in the Worldwide Coalition Media Headquarters. It's the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, deeply in the heart of the city we so love, Providence, Rhode Island, the Naked City. We've told a few stories tonight. Bob Lancia is hopefully going to join us in just a few minutes by phone. We'll talk about, ironically, on a night like today, when our brave first responders, the men and women who are our fire departments are out there in just difficult circumstances. Trained professionals. We're going to talk about 911. That's been in the news the last week or so. We'll revisit his Inspector General legislation, see where that is. They had a major announcement on that this week. And as usual, we'll talk about government in general. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.